For 32 years, he was the Principal Conservation and Design Officer of Islington Council, and he certainly has some stories to tell. Since retiring, he has continued to fight to preserve heritage and environment in London and elsewhere, representing organisations such as Save Britain's Heritage, the Victorian Society, and the Spitalfields Trust. Today, the title of his talk is Pressure for Change. Alec, we look forward to hearing you talk this morning.
Thank you very much. And very good morning. Tremendous crowd of people. It's a while since I've been in this magnificent building, restored, of course, after terrible war damage. Only really the front and steeple survived the bombing, but the church was beautifully rebuilt by Celia Paget in the 1950s. One of Islington's great spaces, I think. Well, I'm not really going to talk that much about Islington this morning. I'm going to sort of widen the range to cover London and indeed beyond London. And the pressure for change is really the pressure for development that I'm going to talk about. I did work in Islington for a very long time, and one of the things that we sought to do over all those quite difficult decades of the 70s, 80s and 90s was try to make Islington the best place in London to live, work and play. And I think we sort of succeeded in doing that, and I hope those of you who live in Islington agree with that. And we did it largely through trying to make the best of the historic environment.
Could we just stop? Is the sound all right? Or should I give you my personal mic?
Yeah.
Is that better? Is that better?
Okay. You can't hear now?
It's all right.
Okay, well, it's right. I mean, I'm happy to use the hand thing if that's better.
That's good.
It's fine. Okay, well, shout if it's not, or wave your arms if you can't hear. Just to remind ourselves of how lovely Islington actually is. Camden Passage, Clerkenwell Green, landmarks of church towers are important. Here at the Angel, how we coped with the pressures for new office development at the Angel. This is the building on the south-west corner, under construction in the early 2000s. And what we sought to do was keep the scale appropriate so that new buildings wouldn't dominate the landmarks that you see there of the old corner house and the former cinema north of Pentonville Road. Again, this is Goswell Road. A lot of redevelopment there, but the scale was kept, I think, to a suitable and human scale. The proportions of the buildings to the width of the street. These are long-established things that have controlled the development of cities for a long time. Inserting new buildings where there was a gap. Here you can see it's a quirky modern design, but the scale is right. It picks up exactly with the parapets either side of the terrace. And here, just further down St John Street, near Smithfield, very recently completed building, just finished last year. Again, filling a gap site next to the wonderful Farmerlows building. And again, a design that's been moulded, broken up. It's quite a big building, but I think it fits into its context pretty well. And again, the development either side of the dear old Hatton Feathers public house on the corner of Clerkenwell Road and Goswell Road. just recently reopened, I'm very pleased to say. It's been unopened for about 30 years. Anyway, it's been restored and the bar is serving drinks. But the empty car park either side has been built on now, and again the scale is deferential to the corner building, so you can still see the parapet against the sky. Again, Clerkenwell Road, a new hotel was opened on the old petrol filling station site. Again, picking up the parapet heights. And this has been going on for a while. This is a sort of pioneering building. I'm sure some of you know it. It's Janet Street Porter's house in Britton Street, 1987, when Clerkenwell was very down at heel. Nobody wanted to live there. All the industries had closed. And we were looking for pioneers to resettle it. And Janet Street Porter was one of those. And she bought an empty site for virtually nothing and got Piers Goff to build this quirky house for her. It was controversial at the time, particularly the blue roof. Not quite sure why, but some people didn't like it. They'd obviously not been to see Gaudi's works in Barcelona. But there it is. It's now a listed building. It was listed 5 years ago as a particularly good example of 1980s architecture. And the critical thing here is the scale. The scale is right, the dimensions are right. You can pick holes in the architectural style if you like, but it's the scale that's really good. So, this is not Islington, this is Vauxhall. And the pressure for change in many parts of London is becoming extreme, and increasing craze for building tall. There's been quite a lot of that going on at Vauxhall for the last 15 years. The circular tower on the right-hand side foreground was built about 15 years ago, and for a long time it was by far the highest building in that neck of the woods. Indeed, it's the building that the helicopter crashed into a few years ago. You probably remember that. Very unfortunate accident. But it's becoming dwarfed now by its neighbours. Most of the developers seem to be Chinese or Malaysian, and they're by and large blocks of flats with nobody living in them. They've been bought as investments. And you can see the site outlined in red for more of the same. Here's the model of the current planning application for what the developer wants to do on the site. Yet more towers, a few lower blocks, a few offices. But it's almost a New York environment, and that's increasingly what we're facing up to in London. This is Elephant and Castle, a new scheme to completely regenerate the Elephant and Castle, which of course was largely a post-war development built in the 50s, 60s and 70s, which had its problems, but the answer to that has been to sweep it all away, including the shopping centre, and to build on a much larger, higher scale. These sort of images that one gets from architects and developers, they're nearly always elevated, and not actually what you're going to see from the street. Again here, this sort of bird's eye views, which fine for the pigeons, but not really what human beings are going to experience. So you need to really get lower down, street level, and appreciate just what sort of presence these buildings have on the public realm, the pavements, the roads, massive structures looming over you. local planning authorities are very susceptible, I think, to the images that developers present. The sun, of course, is always shining in their images. This is a view, and the people are always young and beautiful. The trees are always in leaf, of course. The trees have also grown up miraculously. And it all looks rather idyllic. But the reality is a far cry from this. Tall buildings tend to project long shadows. Again, more images here of just how wonderful it's all going to be, and immaculately maintained planting, children playing in fountains, etc. And I think, people think, oh, it should be like Granary Square, where you've got the fountains with all the children playing. But of course, that is a very large space which is not overlooked by tall buildings, not overshadowed, whereas this sort of space is going to be extremely overshadowed. Again here, the sun never sets. Battersea Power Station has been a long-running saga. It stopped making electricity back in the early 1980s, and it then became a problem site. It was bought and sold, various people trying to make a go of it, failing. These are some images of it that some of you may remember from the image. Wonderful bit of industrial heritage. It became a listed building. It was built, of course, by Giles Gilbert Scott, the grandson of George Gilbert Scott, who also built the Bankside Power Station where the Tate Modern is. And eventually, about 15 years ago now, a developer came forward who said he could make a go of it. But in order to do the necessary restoration, repairs to the listed building, he needed a lot of other development to go alongside it to pay for it. And he came up with his viability studies and all this stuff that developers do, huge long documents written by professionals, and very difficult, of course, for local authorities to challenge it. They don't have the expertise or the staff numbers to be able to do it. So development started. Everybody got very excited about the chimneys. In the end, they had to be taken down and rebuilt in sort of facsimile. But of course, what was also going up, as you can see, is the peripheral development that pays for it all. And that peripheral development comprises 14,000 flats. Now, the original idea to comply with planning policies was that 35% of that housing was going to be what's called affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is usually defined as 80% of market value. So that's still pretty expensive in London terms anyway. And of all that affordable housing, I think only a quarter of it was going to be social housing. So that's paying sort of council rents. So that was 35%. It was agreed once with council. I think the permission was something like in 2010. The developer then came back, again with another huge feasibility study and saying, we can't make that work. The maximum I can have on the site is 18% of affordable housing. So council agreed that, and a year later they came back again and it was whittled down to 8%. And what we've actually ended up is just 2%. 2% of those 14,000 is going to be affordable housing. disgrace, given the housing crisis in London. And here we can see more of it. Again, perhaps even the more sort of shocking thing is that the blocks that have been finished are nearly all unoccupied. There's nobody living in these places. They've been bought, often by overseas businesses, corporations, whatever, as an investment. They're bought to leave. They don't want people living in there that might mess it up. They're so rich they don't need the rent. So they sit there as an investment. London, of course, is a safe haven, or regarded as such by a lot of foreign investors, particularly in the Middle East and Far East, where, of course, there are concerns about war and invasion and all this sort of stuff, which London doesn't really suffer from. So London is a place where money's been poured into, and a lot of that money's gone into property, and property that isn't actually doing very much for Londoners. So here we get to the one of the sort of shopping malls, I suppose, or a public realm, that you've got the power station on the left-hand side and one of these blocks on the right. And you can see that actually it's not bathed in sunshine here. It's rather a dark and oppressive space, really. And not as lively as it perhaps would be if all those flats were occupied. Inside, and some of you may well have been and seen all this, but inside the great generating hall most of it is a shopping centre. So it's a bit like Westfield or one of those malls, quite posh shops. And again, not particularly busy. I think shop retailers are wanting to get a foot in here, hoping that it will become more of a destination. And we'll see about that. So there's not much vacancy, but there are not many people in the shops yet, in my experience of having been there. You can go up one of the chimneys in a lift and enjoy spectacular views from the top, out over those towers of Vauxhall I was telling you about, but also down onto the river. Again, those are the Vauxhall Towers, and you're looking eastwards towards the city and Docklands. And then this is an image of more of the flats still actually under construction. One of the sad things I think about this enabling development is just how tall it is. So it blocks a lot of the views of the power station that you get from south of the river. The only really good view that's left of the power station is from the north bank of the Thames, and of course if you're on a boat going past. Battersea has been, I think, a disaster in terms of what the site could have offered in terms of housing for London. And housing does seem to be acknowledged as the great crisis that London is facing, and where most of the pressure for change is occurring, particularly in the policies of the Mayor of London and even the government to sort of produce housing at all costs. I'm sure Tony Travis will indeed talk about this in greater detail when he comes next month, and it'll be interesting to hear his take on it. But the way we're going at the moment, expecting the private sector to provide social housing, it hasn't worked very well for the last 40 years, and there's not much sign of it working any better under the current regime. the only solution in my book is for government, that's central and local government, to build social housing itself, to start up a council housing building programme again on sites that they acquire, perhaps from private owners who aren't doing much with it. I mean, of course, an even more radical approach would be for the government to requisition some of those empty flats. Don't buy them, just requisition them, a bit like the government did in the war when it took over hotels and whatever to put troops in, goodness knows what, emergency powers. You pay the owner a rent, so the owner's getting something, and you put people who need housing into those empty flats. Can't see anybody in the government going down that route, but it would solve quite a problem. Say Woodlands Heritage and Shelter done a joint bit of work on this, and they reckon that there are 450,000 empty homes in London at the moment. Don't know how many are on the waiting list, but it would help. Pressure for change is also affecting sites that were developed in the 80s and 90s. This is Canada Wharf, the Surrey docks on the south side of the river, great bending river east of the city. The Surrey docks were developed for quite low-rise development in the 80s and 90s. Actually, a lot of social housing was put in, a lot of which is just 2 or 3 stories. There are parks, there are some industrial estates with sort of sheds on, etc. Well, there's a proposal now to replace a lot of that, and of course to build high-rise, and the 2 images that you can see on the left is existing, and on the right is what's proposed. And here are some images of some of these towers. The tower has become seen as the solution to all problems, but again, that's something that I think needs challenging. Towers are very expensive to build, and post-Grenfell, and the inquiry that's been on that, there are increasing requirements now for not just one staircase and lift core, but secondary or tertiary cores, which all adds to the cost and takes up space. Maintenance of towers is incredibly expensive. You can't just put scaffolding up very easily. If you do, it's very, very expensive. Just cleaning the windows isn't that easy. Lifts have got to work. And so you've got to have a maintenance regime that will come out immediately if the lift doesn't work. Are they suitable places for children to live? Question mark. Some people say they are, others don't, but what is for sure, if you're high up in the building and your kids are playing at ground level, it's quite a long way away to see what they're doing. As places where communities develop, are towers as good as terraces, where people interact on the street. In a tower, which is sort of a terrace put on its side, the street is really just the lift, and the lift core. And how people behave in lifts is rather different to how they behave on the street, in my experience. Anyway, some more images. You can argue about the impact on the setting of heritage buildings. These are the former dock offices in the foreground, listed buildings. They're in beneficial use, there's no question about taking those down, but these towers certainly belittle, put it that way, the clock tower that was intended to be a landmark isn't quite the landmark that it was with the tower behind it. And again, some more images. Doesn't have to be like that. To show you, this is a development in Havering, so an outer London borough, but here is a site, you can see on the right some old terraces, and new development, which is quite dense. It's 5-6 stories of a mixture of flats and some offices, and here's an image of it. So it's hugely increased the density of accommodation that was there before. You can see in the grey around it what the sort of hinterland is like. But it's stitched in, I think, quite sympathetically. Mansion block scale, because London's full of mansion blocks, not particularly Islington. But if you go to Kensington and look at the stuff that's around Sloane Square or around the old Albert Hall, you see those 7, 8, 9, something 10-storey, very solidly built red brick blocks providing apartments. Very, very high density living, but it's worked and people still relate to the street. So I think there is a way of doing it without building towers. Here's another image of it. And as you can see, there is a chance here, genuinely, for daylight and sunlight to penetrate the public realm that's around these buildings. I suppose the nearest thing in Islington recently is the Mount Pleasant development. It's still being built, of course, and it's a site that's shared with Islington and Camden. But you can see the sort of scale here. It's some of it's a bit high, I think, but some of it's all right. And because the density here is extremely high. Public realm, there could be more of it. The streets are quite narrow around Mount Pleasant, it's not ideal. But this is, if there has to be more squeezed in, this is probably the way to do it than putting 30, 40-storey towers on sites. Because in conservation areas, any sort of redevelopment can become very contentious. This is a scheme just over the border in Dartmouth Park, Camden, which is producing amazing furore amongst local residents. The replacement of what was just a 2-storey post-war house, a bomb site replacement, with this, it's actually a 6-storey block of flats. And it's big for its context here. It'll be interesting to see how Camden deal with this. In Islington, because we have very strict policies for our conservation areas which demarcate what height should be and how you can extend and whatever. So sort of everybody knows where they stand before they start. Camden doesn't quite have that, and it tends to make decisions more on the hoof. That's possibly why they end up with something like this, that perhaps you wouldn't get this sort of application in Canterbury. Who knows? Another tweak to the housing situation is the so-called demand for student housing. Now, everybody knows that the number of students coming to London or coming to Britain has increased enormously, and indeed universities greatly rely on them and their massive fees that they have to pay. And a lot of developers have been cashing in on the demand for student housing. Now, student housing doesn't count as sort of permanent accommodation, so there are no space standards for student housing. They don't even have to have their own kitchen or bathrooms. They can be shared in a sort of cluster. I remember remember that as a student myself. And that sort of thing is sort of fine for you. Anyone doesn't know any better, I suppose. Although this market that developers are seeking to exploit is the overseas student. Perhaps they're paying £30,000 to £40,000 a year for their fees, and their rich parents may well be happy to pay exactly the same for a student room. So the developers can see that they can potentially earn a huge amount per square metre of accommodation that they provide. So there's been a flood of applications in London. This is one at the southern end of Wandsworth Bridge, I think it is, in Wandsworth. Wandsworth actually shows more images of it. Again, all very idyllic with all these canoeists going past. Really standing out in the townscape. I mean, this is a shocker, really, in an area where there aren't any other towers at the moment. Wandsworth have refused it on townscape grounds, but it's been called in by the Mayor of London, and the concern is that the Mayor is going to approve this, for the reason that the Mayor, in order to try and meet his housing targets, is now saying that student housing counts towards the housing target of London. Shock horror, it's a disgrace, and you should talk to your local MPs about this and your local GLA councillor, because it's almost criminal. The implication, of course, is that if student numbers don't materialise, or if the government says we don't want so many foreign students coming, blah blah, these student blocks will indeed become housing as permanent housing. Given the terrible space standards that a lot of them have, that is slums of the future, I would suggest. Let alone the incredible, as I said, maintenance cost of these sort of towers. There's another image of it. We've had one such proposal recently in Islington. This is Archway. This is the Archway Tavern in the foreground. You're looking up from Holloway Road, the top of Holloway Road, looking up, and this is the tower that's proposed on the former hospital site that's between Archway Road and Highgate Hill. There's another image of it. The council, Islington Council, have done the right thing, and they've refused this application, but it has been called in by Sadiq Khan. And again, the worry here is that he'll approve it, and that this student housing will count towards his housing targets. So there are battles to be fought over this. And that's completely setting aside the townscape impact here of this tower. You can see the turret spire of the late Victorian building, Saxon Snell building, which is itself a wonderful landmark which would just be completely obliterated by the tower. Well, turning now away from housing to commercial development. This is an image taken in 1983. Greenwich Park, looking as the Queen's House in the foreground, the Royal Naval College, the river, and beyond the Docklands, mainly derelict at that time, rows of cranes and empty sheds. And of course we had the Docklands Development Corporation, and this was going to be a new regeneration area for London, taking the pressure off the city. That was the idea. And of course this is what we've ended up with. Everybody knows this cluster of towers, Canary Wharf, which for a long time was the tallest building in London and sort of stood out on its own, can hardly make it out now. And there it is, sort of take it or leave it. It has clearly impacted on the setting of the heritage buildings in the foreground. But in terms of the Docklands itself, perhaps less so. And if that was going to have solved London's commercial problems, then maybe that was a good idea, in rather the way that Paris did that with La Défense. Paris has very strict controls over tall buildings in its centre, and they decided quite a long time ago that all the new big lumpy stuff would go out in the suburbs, and there it is. Central Paris is still very beautiful. We could have done that in London, but of course we didn't. The City Corporation, a unique bit of local government in that, as an authority, they go back to the Middle Ages, so they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years before any other sort of proper local government was brought into being, before the London County Council, that were just parish vestries. So the city has always been a law unto itself, and always saw Canary Wharf as a rival, and has made sure, by its influence in the wider world, that it has developed tall buildings within the city. And here you can see ones that have been built on the right there. You've got the extraordinary walkie-talkie near the river, doing everything that towers don't normally do. Most towers either go up straight or they taper. This gets bigger as you go up, so it's always been rather uncomfortable. But further back you can see the Gherkin, partly obscured by the cheese grater, Richard Rogers' building on Leadenhall Street. And then the tallest building there is 22 Bishopsgate. So hideous it hasn't actually been given a nickname, but there it is. And to the right is the former NatWest Tower, built started in the 70s, finished in the early 1980s by Richard Seaford, which for a long time was the only really tall building in the city. Now it's completely dwarfed. Well, that's now, and this is what the city have approved. So these are all schemes that have got permission. Some of them are just beginning to start, but this is what the city is wanting, and it's wanting more. So a couple of weeks ago there was a public inquiry which I went along to, representing Save Britain's Heritage. The city, in its new development plan, the City 2040, they call it, they're saying that they've got a demand for 1.2 million square metres of new floor space. And to do that, they need to be able to build towers pretty much everywhere in the city. So that includes in its conservation areas. And so they want to extend this cluster of towers in all directions. And there have been, I wouldn't say howls of protest, but protest from historic England, the royal palaces, because the backdrop view of the Tower of London will be compromised if these towers continue to the right. Poor old Tower of London will just be dwarfed. But I'm pretty sure that the City of London will get its way. The current government seems to accept that the only way forward is growth, and anybody who wants to do growth can do it. So I don't think they're going to stand in the way of what the city is planning. Whether the city's particularly wise about this, because there's another question. One of the most controversial, recently approved schemes is this Eric Parry building on Leadenhall Street, replacing a 1960s rather elegant mini tower. It's only 20 stories tall, so it's tiny in city terms. Replacing that with what is going to be the tallest building in the city, almost as tall as the Shard on the Southern Bank. And the most extraordinary thing about this proposal is that the existing public realm, which you see in the foreground, the developer, the architect, Eric Parry, is proposing this great canopy to sail over it. So blocking out even more of the daylight, the little daylight that it currently enjoys. Again, the image here that is shown with sun is completely misleading. I mean, how they get away with this stuff is bewildering. To the left-hand side of this picture is the cheese grater, the Rogers building, which was completed in about 2014, I think. And again, I remember the images for this, which showed this building was on stilts, and the ground floor area was shown as beautiful gardens with young mothers pushing prams and little children playing in the sunshine. So the reality is that they couldn't get anything to grow there. The grass has been replaced by AstroTurf, and they've had to put up 3-metre high glass walls to stop people being blown over by the wind that howls through it. So the reality is a disaster. And yet the planners, planning officers, councillors were all seduced by these beautiful images. And as I indicated earlier, that sort of stuff is still going on. Well, is the city going to be a nice place to work? I think that's something the city aren't really thinking about. And I'm not sure the developers are long term. This is all sort of short term, quick buck stuff. Certainly if you walk around this existing tower cluster, you can end up with a very seriously crimped neck if you want to look up and see the top of these things. This is the Bishopsgate building, 72 stories high. And I would challenge whether this is really a good working environment for the future. Here, more images of and the impact on heritage. Well, the city say quite brazenly that the city is cheek by jowl. It's a city of contrasts, and it really doesn't matter what you put up next to an old building. This is Holborn Viaduct, one of the 4 corner buildings that was erected at the side of the viaduct when that was put up in 1840. Beautiful things, and they provide staircases that take you down to Farrington Street below. Well, this is a building that was put up, finished about 8 years ago, wavy glass. Now the same thing is happening on the other side. So this seems to be perfectly acceptable. The concept of setting of historic buildings in the city seems to have gone by the board. And the real worry, I think, is that the city don't really care about preserving views of St Paul's Cathedral. And from what was being said at the inquiry, they might be perfectly happy for higher buildings to go up and block the views that we know and most of us love, I think. This is Paddington Basin. There's the Westway running past it, elevated Westway on the left-hand side. And again, I remember Paddington Basin back in the 80s when, again, a lot of the industry had closed, and it was quite vacant site. But the waterway was wonderful, and there were people living there in boats and whatever. And of course it's been completely overshadowed now by tall office blocks. Here we see some images, developers' images. Because a lot of these, they never show actually how tall the buildings are. The landscape, they really needed to have a portrait image to get the full 40 stories of the building in, but they don't do that. And a bit of the absurdity of here's just the little skin of one of the old warehouse buildings that was kept, just as a sort of bit of wallpaper on the front of the new development behind, just tokenism, in my view. And again, sort of rather beautiful images of community spaces and whatever, but the human form is very much dwarfed here. Paddington Station, again, is under threat of being sort of hemmed in. This is a building to the left here that was put up in the 1990s, respecting the scale of the wonderful station hotel at Paddington. But what has been built on the other side now, the so-called Paddington Cube, is an enormous lump that lowers over the Brunel train shed, very unfortunately. Pressure for change on the edge of the city. While the city are pursuing their clusters of towers or whatever, there are developers sort of snapping at the heels of the fringes of the city. This is an area known as Norton Folgate, on the east side of Bishopsgate. It's actually in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. But as you can see, area of Victorian warehouses, some older buildings, great variety of fabric here, little back courtyards, nooks and crannies, alleys. This land was all owned by the City Corporation. So the City Corporation, as well as being a planning authority and also a property developer in their own right, they own huge areas of land and have done forever. They own Epping Forest, they own Burnham Beaches, lots of farms out in Norfolk, all sorts of stuff, probably half of Oxford Street.